Now we want to render the content of each TD. As you can see here, in the first TD, we're simply rendering a property of a movie object. But in the last two columns, we are rendering custom content, such as a like component or a delete button. This is the tricky part. So for now, let's focus on the first four columns. So back in the table body component, here in TD, we want to render a property of this current item. So we get item, which is our current object. We use the bracket notation to access a property dynamically. What is that property? That is column.path. However, this only works for simple properties. If you're dealing with nested properties, this does not work. In this application, one of our properties is genre.name. So we cannot use the bracket notation here. Instead, we're going to use Lodash. So on the top, we import underscore from Lodash. Now Lodash has a method called get. So let's delete this. Here in this expression, we call underscore or Lodash.get. We pass our object, that is item, and then the target property that can be nested. So that is column.path. Let's save the changes. Back in movies table. So we have taken care of these first four columns. Before we get to the other two columns, let's test the application up to this point. So I want to comment out this entire T-body section. Let's select all this. On Mac, press Command and slash. On Windows, press Control slash. With this, we can comment out code in JSX. Now finally, we need to import this component on the top. So import table body from common/table body. Save the changes. So here in the browser, you can see the body of our table is rendered properly. Obviously, we don't have these two buttons here. We also have a warning about the lack of a unique key. We'll get to that shortly. So we successfully rendered the first four columns. Now let's look at the other two columns. So back in the movies table component, let's uncomment this piece of code. So in this column, we have a like component. Earlier, you learned that these JSX expressions get compiled to React elements, which are plain JavaScript objects. As an example, here on the top, I'm going to declare a constant, call it x, and set it to an age 1. You know that this is a React element, which is essentially a plain JavaScript object. The same is true when we have a like component. So that like component that we are referencing in a JSX expression is essentially a plain JavaScript object. So just like we can pass any objects to functions or use them as values of properties, here in our columns array, we can add a new property, call it content, and set it to a JSX expression like this. That's perfectly valid, right? So let's delete this line. I'm going to grab the reference to our like component and put it here. So here's our like component, select, cut, and then put it here as the value of the content property. Good. We're going to use the same approach with the delete column. So here's our delete button, cut, and then add a content property here and set it to this button. Beautiful. Now we can get rid of this T-body element. This is no longer used. So delete, save the changes. Back in the browser, we have a few errors here. In movies table component on line 14, movie is not defined. So here in the movies table component where we are defining our columns, line 14, obviously here we have a reference to movie, but we don't know which movie. So how can we fix this problem? Well, we can replace this value with a function. So instead of setting this to a React element, we set this to a function that takes a parameter like movie and returns a React element. Now movie is the parameter that we're passing here. We have a similar issue with unlike. What is unlike? This is part of the props object. So this movies table, we have used this in our movies component. Here's our movies table. Look, we have unlike, undelete, unsort. These are the events that this movies table is going to raise. So back in our movies table, instead of unlike, we should reference this.props.unlike. Okay? Now we need to make the same change to the last column. So here's our content property. Instead of setting this to a React element, we set it to a function that takes a movie object and returns a React element. And next we need to prefix this with this.props. Good. Save the changes. Back in the browser, we still have a warning about the unique key. You can see our table is partially rendered, but we don't have the buttons. Because in our table body, for now, we're just rendering a property of a movie object. So we need to change this such that if this column has a content property, we're going to render that content, which can be a like or a delete button. So here we need to have a conditional statement. I would rather to extract this logic into a separate method to clean up this code. So let's add a new method here, render cell. This method takes two parameters, the current item and column. They go to this code block. Now here we can check if column.content exists, if it's defined. If it's truthy, we're going to call this, which is a function. So column.content, it's a function. We give it an argument, which is this item. That's the movie we are rendering, right? And this will return a React element. Let me show you one more time. So this content is a function that takes a movie or an item and returns a React element. So whatever this function is returning, we'll simply return it here. Otherwise, if we don't have this property, we're going to render a property of the current item. So we cut this here and return it right here. And finally, we'll call this new method right here, this.renderCell. We give it the item and the column. Okay, let's test the application. So you can see our table is rendered. Don't worry about that warning. We'll get to that in the next lecture. Let's test the sorting. That works. Paging, beautiful. Filters. Awesome. Next, we'll fix the issue with the key.